two, three. Take me out to the ball game. Take me out to the crowd. Buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jack. I don't care if I ever get back. Oh, it's root for the Cubbies. If they don't win, it's a shame. For it's 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out at the old ball game. Hey!
This is
the Monday Morning Quarterback on the 25th of November 2019. Boston Red here in the Jerry Pippin Memorial Broadcast booth. An interesting episode coming up here, and incidentally, you can find our episodes where you get your basic podcasts, including on Twitter. Twitter is a very good instrument. YouTube is also there. We also have iHeart, one of the number ones in the world as far as podcasting is concerned. And there is Stitcher. Stitcher is a mobile app. All of these are mobile, incidentally. You can get them mobile, or you can get them on regular computer, old school as they say, as we do also. So we'll get right into it here. And just remembering also that November, I have the precise date here, would been Jerry Pippin's 80th birthday. Jerry passed in 2015. We do have a Thanksgiving program, and we'll go back to 2010 and look at working class O'Donnell. There in 2013, she was running in 2010. Excuse me, she was running in Delaware at the time, but and we had the Tea Party Express, etc. Much of that political headwinds is still blowing around, and we hear it even blowing today. Getting into today's news, Mr. Bloomberg of the Bloomberg Media Organization has formally announced that he's running for president. He's 77 years old. So we have a number of people in their mid and moving later 70s, Joe Lunchbox Biden and Bloomberg. Now, Bloomberg has a new strategy going forward. It's not unusual. We worked in campaigns at this mic that people have used a similar type of approach or stratagem. And basically what his strategy is not to waste his time on Iowa and New Hampshire, because they are already going into the box, so to speak. The Democrats in the contest already are fighting for what little flesh they can get off the bone. Basically there. And then, of course, you go into Nevada. Nevada is another retail politic state. And South Carolina, of course, South Carolina, the Democratic Party there is composed of followers of O.J. Simpson, African people. So what Bloomberg will do is get his eggs in the basket, so to speak, into Super Tuesday. And Super Tuesday is one of those types of setups, because you have all these states, but it does take a lot of funding. And he is preparing himself now. This type of campaigning that he plans to do, you always have to seed the clouds, so to speak, to make it rain. And that's what he's doing, $30 million into social media, and of course he'll be advertising on cable. For those that do not know him, he was a mayor of the city of New York. He has been a moderate Republican, so to speak, and he moved from moderate to independent, not unusual there. And now he's back as a Democrat, a centrist Democrat. Now, what does centrist Democrat mean? Well, it doesn't mean what it did when it was pretty much coined by Wild Bill Clinton back in the 90s. And in that election where Wild Bill was elected, Ross Perot, late H. Ross Perot, ran out of Dallas, Texas. as basically a populist, centrist, whatever you want to call him. He ran and got about 30% of the vote. So yes, you can do that. He did participate in, he was on TV, some of the debates, etc. Bloomberg's going to skip the debates because he's self-funding. Well, he can afford to self-fund. His net worth is $50 billion and more, and he can put in as much money as need be. Now, how he will shake up the contest? Well, Bloomberg has been involved in a number of political movements or political cause celebs, whatever you want to call them. The gun issue, he's been very, very prominent on that. He's also been prominent on issues of nutrition. In Chicago, he was in the tax on what is called sugar. And so he's been involved in those kinds of things, and his gun philosophy out there, I think he'll probably spin just a sensible gun control, as they now call it, based on that. Now, with an advanced media campaign, you basically back to the seeding. How you do this, you seed it to get the name out, so he's working on social media, and he's also working the cable channels, etc. Now, this will eventually evolve to targeted TV ads in those states, and he does have time to do that because we're looking at the clock now. We have December and January as set up for finishing off. February will be the Iowa caucus, and then the news media will leave Iowa, and they will not be back for basically 4 years. Des Moines will be forgotten. It'll be again a flyover joint. And then you go into New Hampshire. New Hampshire, of course, is in New England. It is a more rural state than some. And Bloomberg decided, well, we can forget that one. Nevada, he'd have to do some campaigning there, and he really doesn't want to do that. And again, back to the narrative of South Carolina. But when you start talking about California, these very, very large states, Texas, and all of these Super Tuesday states, I don't have my list here, unfortunately, but these Super Tuesday states, a person that can afford to spend millions of dollars in media will get an impact. And now the basic talking heads, pundits, etc., are trying to figure out, well, where does he fit in this race? Well, he looms large on some of the votes probably that Joe Lunchbox Biden would get from some of the suburban voters, etc., that are still in that time warp. And also it sends a message that there are some people obviously are not that satisfied with Joe Biden. I noticed over the weekend he got the former governor of Iowa, Vilsack, is that his name? Anyway, and his wife to endorse him. They are people that run the political framework of the Democratic Party I have in the past in Iowa, which is weak now. They've had Dranstad, every Republican governors, Republicans running all through the cornfields of Iowa. So how much that endorsement is worth, well, we don't know. That doesn't hurt Joe Lunchbox Biden, but at the same time, you have well-organized campaigns there in Iowa from Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. And in the so-called moderate wing there, you have Mayor Pete out of South Bend. How this will affect him? Will he continue to go up in the polls? We'll be looking at a poll from Emerson Polling in Boston, across from the Common, basically. We'll look at that particular poll and see where it is. But we have the holiday weekend also. But once more, these centrist candidates out there, where does that leave them? If Biden numbers fall, Amy Klobuchar, for instance, will she benefit? From some of the numbers we're seeing, she is rising in Iowa. We had anticipated that rise, but she needs to rise much more, because she definitely does need to get one of the 4 seats out of Iowa, possibly 5. there, and she could very well be in that position. And this thing of Bloomberg entering, will some of Joe Lunchbox Biden's supporters decide, well, we'd better set up with a different candidate and go past Iowa and New Hampshire and go into Nevada. Now, Nevada is a state, it's a union state. Joe Lunchbox Biden is doing okay there at the present time. And now, let's not get illusionary here. His candidacy as far as the long slag, he could conceivably stay in the race all the way to Milwaukee. He's capable of doing that. And definitely Bernie will be in the race all the way to Milwaukee, so will Liz Warren. And I suspect so will Amy Klobuchar, depending on what happens after Super Tuesday, because part of this will be funding. Those that survive Super Tuesday can probably go on. Those that don't, such as Senator Booker out of New Jersey, his campaign is more tenuous. We are not going to be obviously hearing very much from our friend out of Texas there, Julian Castro. He was not on the debate stage. He'll probably still be doing some campaign. Tom Steyer, of course, is a multi-millionaire billionaire. He's got the money. He can stick around there. Marianne Williamson, yes, she'll stick around. So you've got some people. She was not on the stage, but nonetheless, she will be there, very well known in California. So this thing is not completely sewed up as of yet. But it is changing, and these types of campaigns, as Bloomberg is running, if you recall, Trump started out with his campaign where he was basically self-funding it, flying around in the Trump plane, etc. The Bloomberg, he will have a plane to fly around in, and if he's adroit in this effort, he would go to Iowa, although he's skipping Iowa, just the idea of going to Iowa and getting the publicity. Now, free publicity doesn't really matter for him, but what you do in these kinds of campaigns, you can fly, say, into Des Moines, talk to people in Des Moines, perhaps go out into the hinterland a little bit and talk to those people, and then use that particular setting for some of your commercials that you are airing yourself. And that same situation is going into New Hampshire. Although you're not on the ballot there, you still need to go there, because in nationalized campaigns, you need to get nationalized. Going to Vegas is go to Vegas, walk around, talk to some of the workers there, and that sets you up to go to California. And as far as his stop and frisk situation is concerned, going into a place like South Carolina, appearing at a historic African American college, he's done some of that. He did a Baptist church in Brooklyn, but some of that kind of stuff does make up for your commercials that you are filming anyway. Anyway, we'll leave Mr. Bloomberg and his campaign now and move to the military, and in particular the SEALs situation. Spencer, who was the Naval Secretary, was terminated by the Defense Secretary, Minister of Defense, what do you want to call him, Estra. That was based upon the policy of D.J. Trump. And a disgraced SEAL, some have called him a war criminal, named Gallagher, that Trump pardoned. And this is a troubling situation in terms of the military justice system, that you have these and international criminal court activities. You have these characters that are war criminals, and they're being pardoned. But these wars are in a global, worldwide situation. There will be someday here in the U.S. that some of these criminals like Gallagher will be brought to Hague along with other people that have been brought there. Because you get in these wars where you have the EU-type nations involved there. Will they want to be involved with a military that is sponsoring war criminals? And given the changing landscape in Europe and how it's going, particularly in Germany, There are obviously fascistic elements in Germany, but how long will they survive? We look at, say, 5 or 10 years. Those elements either will move to the head or they will start to disappear. And as you get more progressive forces in these countries, and we're talking about Germany, particularly in Australia, what's going on in Australia, that will not bode as well for what is going on in the military. The military has obviously its own, I won't say obvious, that's the wrong word, system there of justice. And where does this leave the military? Here, and the Washington Post says, basically here, Naval Secretary forced out by Pentagon chief over handling of a war crime case of a SEAL, that the SEAL would, in fact, lose his symbol here. This is this Eddie Gallagher, chief petty officer, what he was accused of war crimes in his deployment there, positioning of a corpse with Islamic State. These kind of things are very, very bad situations. Old DJ Trump wrote on his thing, "We thank Richard for his service and commitment." He's talking about Richard Spencer. But again, how does this play out with the broad public? Not talking about with the Trump supporters that are out there. This is a Triton insignia here. This is something, if one retires, and you have the Jesse Ventura has one of these Triton insignias that the special ops people have. And this whole question of special ops, as they do in the military, convening a committee to look at it, because of late here, these so-called special ops type people have been running willy-nilly around, basically vigilantes and terrorists operating more as that than a unified military situation, period. And this in itself causes some problems, period. The next one will be what Breathway, was he an admiral, lieutenant admiral, somewhere along there? What is he? A retired, Navy rear admiral. He's an ambassador now to Norway, plugged in there. A lot of people getting plugged in. Now this rear admiral here is Colin Green. He's commander of naval special. He's the commander of Special Naval Warfare Command. Moved to convene. This is the review board for him and 3 other SEALs involved here. Speculation was obviously Spencer would resign or fired, period. Now, countering recommendations, the president issued pardons to this Matthew Goldstein here, who faced a murder trial next year, and a lieutenant named Clint Laurent, who was convicted of murdering 2 unarmed Afghan men. So these are basically war criminal types here that have been rehabilitated using the pardon power of the president. Usually that is something that occasionally is used and has been used, but not in this particular situation, period. And involve taking away of some silver stars and various medals here. Now, how this whole saga reacts, because Eddie Gallagher person was on Fox and Friends, but you can see this is basically, just look at it as this. It is a political commercial for Trump. Now, this is on the other thing. Bloomberg, who is now known as Mike Bloomberg and not as Michael Bloomberg, will be running these anti-Trump ads. Now, this could be a positive thing for some of the Democrats, in that what it will do is counter some of the money the Republicans are put in here. Let's go to E.J. Dionne here. Now we have E.J. here. What unites Trump's apologists? Minority rule. And this is interesting, very thoughtful by E.J. 2 questions are asked again and again. How can European evangelicals continue to support a man as manifestly immoral as President Trump? And how can congressional Republicans refuse to condemn Trump's thuggish efforts to use taxpayers' money to intimidate a foreign leader into helping his re-election campaign. Those are some central questions that are asked, but the answer to both relate to power, not just power. Trump now enjoys, but also to the president's faithfulness to a deal aimed at controlling American political life for generations and more. And I remember talking to this evangelical woman before the election, 2018, and she was talking about that, interested in the court and social policy. Both evangelicals and Republican politicians want to lock in the current policy preference, no matter how much the country changes or how sharply public opinion swings against them. As a party, the GOP now depends on empowering a minority over the nation's majority. Well, there's no doubt about that. That is the reason, and this is reflected in the eagerness to enact laws restricting access to the ballot in states it controls, rationalization as a way to fight mythical voter fraud, ID statutes, and the purging of voter rolls, as happened in Georgia, North Carolina. It happened in Ohio, Pennsylvania. All of those places are designed to make it harder for African Americans, Latinos, and the young to vote. The new electorate is a lot less Republican than the old one. They must prefer the old one. The party's staunch defense of the Electoral College is also part of a minority rule strategy. Every model that gives Trump a chance to prevail in 2020 shows he loses the popular vote by even more than he did in 2016. There's no doubt about that. What does a crisis for American democracy look like? A Trump popular vote defeat of 5 million or more, combined with a 2-vote margin in the Electoral College. Yes, he could eke out this narrow victory even if he loses Michigan and Pennsylvania, as long as he held on to other places he carried the last time. Well, that situation is Pennsylvania being a command and control state, Michigan, of course, being the whole home of the UAW, more likely to lose there. The big problem Trump has is states like Ohio. Still, voter suppression, Electoral College, along with partisan gerrymandering, are not foolproof. There is, however, one part of government entity immune from these results of any particular election: the lifetime appointees to judgeships, and DJ Trump has appointed a lot of judges at the district court level. That's in the federal system. Beginning with the Supreme Court, there's where Trump has delivered a big time for those willing to let him do it. Which brings us back to the European evangelicals. The word white is very important because evangelicals of color tend to vote Democratic. More than theology at work here. And of course it's a little moral sense for the followers of JC to support a man like Trump. It points to my Post colleague Michael Gerson has pressed with admirable consistency that evangelical writer William Wallace makes forcefully in his recent aptly named book, Christ in the Crisis, Why We Need to Reclaim Jesus. But the European evangelicals turn out to be prime pragmatists of U.S. politics, as historian Matthew Avery Sutton argues last week in the post made by History section. We know we are losing ground in public opinion issues such as same-sex marriage, an older group than the country as a whole. They also are in a demographic decline as our nation grows more ethnically, racially, and religiously diverse. Here we atheists come. Needlessly, their strength in Republican primaries, dominated by older European voters, continues unabated, which helps explain why Republican politicians are either Trump apologists or immediately mounted with his abuse. The best defense evangelicals have against a new majority is to control the courts. That is happening nation after nation. We remember, recall the history in Chile that when Salvador Allende came into power with his Socialist Party, the way that the right-wing forces were challenged his rule was the conservative courts in Chile. And of course, then they finally went full-blown fascist when Pinochet appeared there in Chile. The courts also mattered to Republican economic elites alarmed by the growing support, even amongst political moderates, for higher taxes on the wealthy and limits on corporate power. So behind all this is industrial capitalism. That's what he's talking about. Conservative judges are rather solicitous towards the interests of property and have historically limited the regulatory reach of government's democratically elected branches. No wonder the majority leader, old man McConnell, has turned the Senate whereby the way the most diverse and populous states are underrepresented. No doubt about that. Been into an assembly line to comfort right-wing judges as quickly as possible. And this is nothing new about established conservative interests. They're trying to limit democracy reach. As a student of mine, Hamoud, carefully reminded me last week in discussion his thesis. I didn't know DJ was teaching, but what ought to disturb us now is how the far evangelical conservatives and Republicans, less honored than never accept Trump exceptions, are willing to go to defeat Trump's to defend his indispensable behavior, because they're entirely complacent with his minority rule project. No doubt about that. In this impeachment fight, democracy is at stake in more ways than we realize. E.J. Dionne. Well, there's no doubt about that. But what is at work here is much more salient. Simply some evangelicals. Yes, the evangelicals are serving the purposes of industrial capitalism or capitalism, and you see that in the Democratic primaries. You have these characters that were staged in there. Little Pete out of South Bend is trying to reinforce these. These are these attacks on Bernie Sanders and Liz Warren. And during the debates on CNN, in the debate out of Atlanta, the commercials were for Big Pharma, etc. So all these organizations and the commercial atmosphere that they have, normally that would be enough to keep this racket going for the next, as Smedley Butler would say, military-industrial complex, going for the next 50 years. But that will not happen, because even capitalism itself is changing. The Green New Deal is coming. Coal companies are filing for bankruptcy right and left. And I also noted, and we'll have this in a numbers man report here, that what has happened most recently, we've had price points in in oil going up, petroleum. Anyway, let's just say a little bit about Mr. Rogers here, and then we'll go. I used to hate Mr. Rogers, then I discovered how much needed him. And this is, we won't go into the whole article here. Martha Manning wrote this article on the 22nd. She's a writer and a clinical psychologist whose book, On the Currents, A Life Beneath the Surface, and The Common Thread, Mother, Daughter, and the Power of Empathy. I used to hate Mr. Rogers. You fit an entire script for an episode on the index card because nothing happened. Fred Rogers opened the show, immediately changed his clothes while he walked, took the somewhat ratty sweater from his fake closet and slowly put it on. For some reason, he had to change his regular shoes into sneakers, though there was no significant physical activity on the show. He had puppets that looked like my grandmother made them. He made negligible efforts to disguise his voice when he spoke. He sung songs in the neighborhood. I would yell Sally as I watched the show with my daughter. You need to speed things up, talk faster, etc. And for God's sake, stop looking into the camera like you are peeking into the eyes of your viewers. He talked about feelings, about kindness, about differences among people, about anger, about abandonment. He talked about isolation, pain, and then mercifully he changed back into his jacket and slowly pulled off his sweater at one point. and replaced them with his shoes. The signal of my impending liberation was his closing song. It's such a good feeling. My daughter sung along. Then I suffered a depression. Suddenly watching TV with my daughter was one thing I could accomplish with little effort. Mr. Rogers started speaking to me softly and softly. He left a space to think. He smoothed me with an unflippable manner when light was hard. He said he never promised magic. Mr. Rogers spoke to the terrific lost child in me. People have said, don't cry to other people for years, he said, and all of this meant is I am too comfortable when you show your feelings. I'd rather them say, go ahead and cry. I'm here to be with you. I lost my footing even more, and I began to show at work and at home. I never had been in situations where I was so consistently failed to meet my goals. And when I missed the mark, I was so much kinder to my family, my friends, my students, my patients than myself. Mr. Rogers said, someday doing the best we can still falls short of what we would like to be able to do, but life isn't perfect on all fronts, on any front. And doing what we can with what we have is the most we should expect ourselves or anyone else. Mr. Rogers gave comfort. He didn't sell it. He didn't knock us over the head with it. He wasn't a cool, sexy, easy. He considered the space between the TV set and the viewer to be sacred, something millions of children understood and their parents forgot. And that's a shame, because we are the ones who need Mr. Rogers' wisdom most of all. The big words, long exclamations, and instructions on how to be and what to do often give us a little solace. Instead, we need an honest voice, considered the darkness and met it with hope, and who recognizes self-hate and met it with compassion. As a child, Mr. Rogers became extremely frightened by something on the news and wondered how he would ever be safe. His mother gave him a simple but profound advice: always look for the helpers. She told him with a quiet certainty that they could always be found. And who are the helpers? Right here, right now, and in our troubled lives. I wept the day that Fred Rogers died, and I will always answer solid yes when he reaches out past knobs and wires and screens and asks, won't you be my neighbor? Fred Rogers originated out of the program out of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. He'd also at one time been a minister. Very, very important situation. We'll do some polling and end the telecast, WBRN Radio. Okay, this is the latest Emerson poll here. They have the approval rating of DJ Trump has increased in the last month with 48% approval and 47% disapproval, a bounce from 43 in the last Emerson national poll that was in October. Support for impeachment has flipped since October from 48% support and with 44% opposed to now 45% opposed and 43% support. The biggest swings amongst independents who opposed impeachment, now at 49 to 34%, which is a reversal from October, where they supported impeachment 48 to 39. Impeachment hearings are being watched and followed by 69% of the voters. A plurality of 26% is getting their news from Fox. 24% are getting their information from one of three networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. 16% are watching CNN. 15% CNBC, and 19% are going elsewhere. The president's support in the primary increased this month to 93%. There's not much going on in the Republican primary because there are no debates out there to keep the head count going. And we're looking at this is the 17th through November 17th through 20th was taken there. Kind of interesting. And this is Trump's at 49%. Bernie is at 50%. And with Liz Warren, they're 50-50. And we look at Trump and not sure whom here. Economy is the number one issue for Republicans, 50%. Independents, 35%, while for Democrats, healthcare ranks at 25%. The overall economy continues to be the most important issue for three voters for 1 in 3 voters, at 34%. And that they would, in declaring they would vote for the president. Healthcare is the second most important issue at 18%, followed by immigration and social issues at 10%. We talked a lot about social issues in DJ Dion's polemic, while environment and impeachment were next at only 7% apiece, with foreign policy least important at 3%. Senator Sanders is gaining momentum in the race, with the nomination increasing 2 percentage points to 27%. Former VP Lunchbox Biden is at 27 also. Elizabeth Warren is in third place at 20%, down a point. The Mayor Pete is at 7% in this poll. Andrew Yang is 4% according to this poll. And the big question, is this poll an outliner or not an outliner? Well, we don't really know. We look at these, 27% for Bernie and Joe Biden, 20% for Warren, 7% for Little Mia from South Bend, 4% for Yang, 3% for Harris, Tom Steyer, Tulsi Gabbard are both at 2% here. Bloomberg has 1% in this, but again, the 1%ers will increase. According to Dr. Kimball, says that Biden and Sanders continue to hold the base, which should concern Elizabeth Warren, as she has wanted one of the front runners to slip past few months, yet their support seems to be crystallized. Sanders continues to hold strong lead with younger voters in the primary. Amongst voters on the 50, Sanders received 37% support, followed by Warren with 22%, and Joe Biden with only 15%, Yang with 7%. Amongst voters 50 and older, Biden continues to lead with 44% support, followed by Warren with 16% and Bernie with 13%. And Buttigieg evidently is at 12%. Voters were asked how much respect they have for the police. 50% said they have a great deal of respect, 31% say they have some respect, and 10% hardly any. This is compared to a Gallup poll, which first asked the question in 1965, found at 71% had a great deal of respect, 22% had some, and 4% hardly any. That was a different kind of poll. Voters, Biden supporters are found to have the most respect for police of the top three candidates. At 65% say a great deal, 26%, and hardly any. Amongst Warren supporters, 36%, a great deal, 44%, some, 20% say hardly any. Within Bernie supporters, 22% say a great deal, 44% have some, and 34% hardly any. Sanders holds the lead among Latinos voters with 36% of the support, followed by Biden with 23%, Warren with 22%. Sanders leads a small margin with European voters at 29%, followed by Biden and Warren 21%. Buttigieg with his Biden leads with African American voters with 42% of support, followed by 18%, and Warren and 17% there. Buttigieg 7%. I wonder where they are. Looking at ideology, Sanders leads with very liberal voters, 45%, followed by Warren with 23%, Biden with 16%, Buttigieg and Yang at 4%. Somewhat liberal voters, Warren and Sanders lead 26%, followed by 23% for Biden and 8% for Yang. Amongst moderate and conservative voters, Biden leads at 39% support. This would be where Bloomberg enters in there, followed by Sanders with 14% and Warren and Buttigieg with 12%. Amongst those who supported Hillary Clinton, Biden leads by 40%, Warren by 18%, and Sanders and Buttigieg by 12%. Amongst those who supported Sanders in the 2016 primary, 48% still supporting, followed by with 23% with Warren and 14% with Joe Lunchbox Biden. These would typically be the crosstabs. When asked if they would definitely vote for the candidate if they changed their mindset, as supporters were the most committed. They have 71%. Said they would definitely vote for him. 60% for Biden, 46% for Warren, 31% for Buttigieg. Said the same thing. A little bit more shaky. When asked if they would support the Democratic nominee for president regardless of who she was, their first choice in the primary, 68% said they were very likely to, 15% they were somewhat likely. 93% of Little Pete's supporters that they were very likely to support the nominee, followed with 80% of Warren, 70% of Biden's. The least likely to support the nominee's top candidate are Bernie supporters, with only 61 responding they were likely to do it. So that's a strange situation there. The two new candidates in the race there, Bloomberg and Patrick. Won't forget about him. Each took less than 1%. Asked if Bloomberg should enter the Democratic primary, only 16% think Bloomberg should. Asked the same question about Hillary Clinton, 24% there. Kimball thinks the only angle and hope candidates like Bloomberg and Patrick have for the nomination is a broken convention, while unlikely the elimination of super delegates in 2020 makes it more possible, though, if it hadn't happened since 1952. I think it was Kefauver for there. 61% of voters are watching the protests in Hong Kong. Significant majority think Hong Kong. That's not there, but anyway, the poll was conducted 17 through the 20th. Incidentally, in Hong Kong, 17 of the precincts, this is more councillor positions there, were won by the protest group there, and not the so-called pro Beijing. I guess they only got one of those. There was a surprise, but one note here. Let me just finish this up. This is 1,092 votes here. And let's see, credibility interval, similar to the poll margin of error, at 2.9%. Very interesting poll here, weighted based on a model of 2016. Is how they put this poll together here. Anyway, this is basically it, how they did it. Both interactive voice of landlines and online panel provided what's called the Amazon trunk. Anyway, this is the Emerson poll, and what it basically said about Iowa at the time. There was a Iowa State poll also that we followed here at WBRN. We reported that on Friday Java, so you have that. And also the Pew people have a guide to polling. I will append it to this broadcast, and we stress or asked, I suppose is a question there, that you at least look at it and see how these polls are put together. So as the Reverend Jesse Jackson would say, you will not be bamboozled. Actually, President Obama also said that out there. So we have all those situations and currents coming here. The Hong Kong situation, they have some kind of dialogue going on in Chile. They also in Bolivia decided they will set a date for new elections. And the Socialist Party, that's a party of Evo Morales, will run a candidate. They have decided on that. We'll keep following that particular situation. In Colombia is where they're going to have some sort of talking thing. The president there is in a lot of trouble. There are still people in the streets there. So a lot of demonstrations going on. There's a bus strike, incidentally, in D.C. I don't want to forget about that one in D.C. there. And there is also a situation in Houston where the state of Texas wants to take over the school system, a very, very large school system. We'll have to do that in our broadcast. And nonetheless, have a good week, everyone, and happy holidays, happy Turkey Day there, and we'll see how this works out. I think I'll take a few days off, but probably after Turkey Day. I'm not certain how that's going to work out, but we shall see.